This is the golden age of the Republicans, Objective 1, about the corruption that marked American politics in the decade after the Civil War. However, you are going to find out in later objectives as well that that corruption will continue on well past this decade, all the way into the late 1800s. But the reason we're calling this lesson the golden age of the Republicans is that, all told, we're dealing with a time period where the Republicans win 15 of 19 elections from 1860 all the way up to 1932, with only two Democrats in between, Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. It's also noteworthy that up until 1900 in this run, every single Republican president was a former Union officer of some sort, most of them generals. But we'll get into that a little bit later on. We're going to start with this guy here, Ulysses S. Grant, if you take a look at letter A on the outline. Now, if you remember, Grant is the Union commander in the Civil War. He's a hero. People are hailing him as the most popular man in America at this time. They're buying him houses in his hometown, in Washington, in Philadelphia as well. And New York actually came up with over $100,000 to give him as a gift. So he's very well liked and a natural candidate for the presidency, especially when people were sick of career politicians after the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. They wanted a fresh face in there. So Grant accepts the nomination. The problem is that he'd never been a politician and really didn't know what he was doing. Great general, not necessarily a great president. Now, Grant, despite having absolutely no political background and the fact that he wasn't even really a Republican, he had actually voted for the Democrats in 1856, wins by a huge majority in the Electoral College, if you take a look at A3, as a Republican. But there were some interesting points about this. First of all, he wins by a huge margin in the Electoral College, but he didn't get most of the white vote. The white vote had basically eluded him because so many Southerners were white, and he was the general that had freed the slaves. So the group that carries him to victory are the new freedmen, the new African Americans who have the right to vote, if you take a look there. Grant doesn't win by much in the popular vote, but remember, you could win a state by 1%, but you get all the Electoral College votes, and that accounts for why the popular vote was so close and the Electoral College vote was so wide. Now, the other thing about this, if you take a look at A4, is that Grant was probably in a little over his head. By most accounts, he's a good guy, and people, for the most part, loved him after the war, especially in the North. But he was walking into a situation where, while he was fighting in the war, politics had gotten very corrupt and very unethical. People had started to rely on political machines to get things done. Judges were bought off. Politicians were bought off. The stock market was manipulated a lot because there wasn't a lot of government regulation of it, so there was a lot of insider trading. And the idea was pretty simple. You do things for me, I'll do things for you. You support me, I'll support you. Now, the most obvious form of this patronage, and that's a definition I want you to understand. Patronage is the idea of granting favors to those who give you political support. The most obvious place for patronage was this place right here in New York City, Tammany Hall. This is what it looks like today. You could still visit it if you wanted to, but it's a kind of a historical landmark now. Tammany Hall was where this guy, a guy named William Tweed, also known as Boss Tweed, probably ran the most notorious patronage system in the country. He was so good at his job and everything like that that most people thought he couldn't be jailed. Most people thought that the law couldn't touch him, including him himself. Now, Tweed actually had a lot of immigrants that he would grant jobs and homes to in exchange for political support. And you have to remember, in those days, this is prior to the secret ballot. So when you went into a polling place, you had to publicly declare who you were going to vote for. It's not like that now, of course, but it was easy for these guys to keep track of how their people were voting and taking all their support systems away from them if they didn't vote the way they wanted them to vote for. Now, these party bosses usually worked for politicians and made things really difficult. Eventually, Tweed does go to jail because of cartoons like this, written or drawn by Thomas Nast. A lot of his immigrants couldn't read, but they could see, and these cartoons got Tweed in a lot of trouble and let his people know what he was doing to them. But Grant had bigger problems than boss Tweed, frankly, and I was often, him being a very easygoing guy, he was loyal to his people from his old Army days, but a lot of those guys turned on him. Some other people just flat took advantage of him. If you take a look at letter B here, B1 that is, this is Jim Fisk, and this is his partner, Jay Gould. Now, you may remember these guys from the old studies we did about Cornelius Vanderbilt. These were the two guys that printed off so many shares of stock in a railroad company that Vanderbilt wanted to buy that they basically depreciated the price. Or before that happened, they sold those shares off and made a ton of money. That's what they basically did, was inflate things and then sell them off before the price could drop. Well, they did the same thing here. These two guys basically convinced Grant's brother-in-law to convince Grant not to let people go to the Treasury and buy any gold. Now, when they did that, they made gold more scarce to the public, and therefore the price of it went way, way up. Well, they sold their gold off before the Treasury started selling it, and once the Treasury started selling it, making it available to the public, and it wasn't as rare anymore, then the price of it went way down. By that time, Gould and Fisk had gotten away with millions. Now, as scandalous as that was, it would get first. Take a look at B2. This is about the Credit Mobilier scandal, and it was discovered after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, the Union Pacific was funded by the U.S. government. They were getting paid anywhere from $16,000 to $48,000 per mile of track, and on top of everything else, the government funded all the construction workers and everybody that Union Pacific hired to build this railroad coming from Omaha. Well, Union Pacific saw an advantage in this and formed their own construction company, the Credit Mobilier Company, in which they hired themselves to do the work at ridiculously inflated prices, up to 385% past what they should have been hiring people for. Now, it didn't affect them at all because the government was the one footing the bill. So not only were they getting paid to lay track, they were also getting paid 385% above what they should have gotten paid by hiring their own construction company. That was pretty ridiculous. Now, what made this worse is that two U.S. congressmen and the Vice President of the United States were partners in the company and were paid to ignore everything. When this became public, it was a major scandal for the Grant administration. It seemed like the Grant administration could not get away from scandal during his administration. If you take a look at B3, the Whiskey Ring of 1875 was a group of whiskey distributors basically going from Indiana all the way to New York, who kept a lot of their revenues that they were supposed to be giving to the government in taxes. This wasn't a problem until it was discovered that Grant's personal secretary was involved with this and that Grant had stepped in to make sure the secretary didn't get in any trouble. On top of this, if you look at B4, Grant's Secretary of War got in trouble for taking bribes to allow certain companies preference over other companies to supply Native American reservations. And if it wasn't scandal, it was something else. Take a look at domestic policy going into Grant's second term now. The Panic of 1873 followed an old familiar formula. Too many businesses being started by people who wanted to get rich, and too many banks giving out too many loans. If you remember, that's how banks make money, is to give out loans and collect on the interest. The problem was, like it happened many times before in American economic history, a lot of businesses failed, the loans go unpaid, and the banks essentially run out of money. Now, in addition to this, a lot of farmers and common people were so far in debt that they wanted to add money to the money flow, whether it be paper money or whatever the case may be, because they wanted to devalue the dollar. They wanted to make sure that it was worth less than what it already was, because that makes prices go up. And if prices go up, inflation, then the debtors can pay off their debts more easily if they can charge more for their products. Well, if you take a look at C1C on the outline, creditors were not in favor of this at all. They wanted to be paid back in gold because they didn't want to see the value of the dollar go down. They wanted the value of the dollar to stay up. So whenever they did get their debt money from the debtors, it would still be worth a lot more. Well, of course, they find a way to convince Grant to pull paper money out of the flow with the Resumption Act of 1875, that's C1D, pull paper money out of the flow of currency to make it more valuable, and also they wanted to avoid the coinage of silver. A lot of debtors, when they lost the paper money battle, said, well, let's coin silver and add that to the money flow. Anything to really reduce the value of money and create inflation. Well, they were not allowed to do that either, and as a result, the common man is extremely upset with U.S. Grant. So that raises the question, how'd this guy even get reelected back in 1872? Take a look at letter D here, the election of 1872. You're going to find that everybody's pretty disgusted with the Grant administration and all the scandals that are in it, and this is before the Panic of 1873 had even happened. Basically, if you take a look there, a group of Republicans decide that they want to reform the government, and they call themselves the Liberal Republican Party. Now, the Democrats actually join them, and they run for president, this guy right here, Horace Greeley. Now, in the end, the Republicans do nominate Grant. The campaign gets pretty nasty. Grant was called an alcoholic, and Greeley was called an atheist, and, it wasn't nice. But Grant wins handily again. But despite the fact that they won, the Republicans kind of saw the writing on the wall, and they figured, we better fix ourselves or someone's going to do it for us. And so the Republicans try to clean up their mess by the time they get to 1876. Now, Grant could have run for a third term. At that time, the two-term limit was only a presidential tradition. But the Republicans decided that they wanted to have this guy run instead, another former Union general named Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, he ran against a guy named Samuel Tilden, who was popular for stopping the Tweed ring. The problem with this is that the race was far too close to call, and for 3 months, nobody knew who the president was going to be going into February of 1877, shortly before the new president was supposed to take office. And so the northern and southern states struck a deal. The Republicans, because the South could have swayed the balance in this thing while they were trying to figure out this whole process. The Republicans say to the South, if you promise to let Hayes be president, then we will remove military presence in the South. Now, a lot of these southern states had been readmitted to the Union, but a military presence was there to make sure that they were still following their commitments to African Americans. With this decision right here, the Compromise of 1877, the military presence or the military armies were taken out of the South, and Hayes was given the presidency. He'd be known as Rutherford Hayes during his entire term from 1877 to 1881, and left Tilden kind of sitting in the dust. Basically, it was the ultimate in patronage and political dealing. And with that, Reconstruction was officially over in 1877. At least protection for the African Americans was officially over. Take a look at letter F there. You'll see that these home rule or redeemer governments, the governments that were left behind after the military presence left, took full advantage of the Republicans being gone. They used all sorts of tactics, if you look at letter A there, to keep blacks out of jobs, homes, voting. Lynching hits record numbers. Literally taking them into the woods and killing them. Jim Crow laws get passed, which were among the different measures to segregate people in the South, having black areas and white areas, or black drinking fountains, white drinking fountains. And this was actually supported by a court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, in 1896, that said facilities could be separate if they were equal. Well, with all these different codes, basically, and the Republicans not being there, Southern governments could do pretty much whatever they wanted to African Americans. Okay, thanks for listening.